Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the fourth and final of this year's breakfast conversations with the Archbishop. As we gather in this place this morning, I begin by acknowledging the original custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and their elders past and present. My name is Chris Lancaster. I'm the Vicar of the Anglican Parish of Altona and Laverton, and it's my pleasure to be this morning's MC for the conversation today. We have a slightly different format this morning in that Archbishop Philip will be in conversation with Professor Manne, and we have John Cleary here to facilitate that conversation, which will, of course, draw you all into the conversation with an opportunity for questions a little bit later on. But coming back to our conversation for today on the pressing topic, can the planet be saved, as we move towards the Paris summit next month? And so here to discuss this topic with Archbishop Philip is Professor Robert Manne, who was educated at the universities of Melbourne and Oxford and was Professor of Politics at La Trobe University until his retirement in December 2012. He's published a large number of extended political essays and has written or edited 20 books on a wide variety of topics. His books and essays have won various awards, including the Washington National Intelligence Centre Prize for the Petrov Affair and a Queensland Premier's Prize for In Denial, The Stolen Generations and the Right. Between 1987 and 2004, he was a regular columnist at different times at the Melbourne Herald, the Australian, the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and also a regular commentator on public affairs for the ABC. And between 1990 and 97, he was editor of Quadrant. Professor Manne is a member of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and in 2005 he was voted Australia's leading public intellectual in a vote conducted by the Sydney Morning Herald. And to facilitate this conversation, we welcome John Cleary, who is a veteran ABC broadcaster and one of Australia's best-known commentators on religion. In his 30-year career with the ABC, he's worked extensively in both radio and television, but is known principally for his association with Sunday nights on ABC Local Radio and the Religion Report on ABC Radio National. He began his career in Perth and was one of the original Compass team on ABC TV and a co-presenter of the philosophy program Meridian on Radio National. For several years, he also appeared in a regular slot on the Triple J morning program with Angela Cattins and Jen Aldershaw. In 2008, John was host of the interfaith event held by the Catholic Church in conjunction with World Youth Day and the visit of Pope Benedict XVI. And he's in high demand as a conference moderator and speaker, not to mention as moderators of conversations with the Archbishop. So we welcome Professor Robert Manne, John Cleary and Archbishop Philip.
Thanks for your attendance here today on what I think is really one of those moments that are going to be of great significance for our entire community over the next few weeks. I noted in the welcome to country and the honouring of the Wurundjeri people that we're honouring a civilization or a custodianship of a country that goes back 50,000 years, and perhaps the debate we're entering into over the next few weeks will determine the future of how we have exercised in a very short space of time our responsibilities over land that's been cared for 50,000 years. Today is, of course, November the 11th, Remembrance Day. On this day 100 years ago, Australians were dying on the shores of the Dardanelles. And for those with an eye for such things, it also marks, of course, the dismissal of the Whitlam government 40 years ago today, which is again in the press this week. And a little further back, of course, November the 11th, 1880, for those with particular fondness for Victorian and Melbourne history, marks the day Ned Kelly was hung at the old Melbourne jail. What brings us here on this Remembrance Day is also a matter of some consequence. This week, France's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who will preside over the coming Paris summit, warned of the looming planetary catastrophe if negotiations fail to pull together a climate rescue pact Quote, "It is life on our planet itself which is at stake." Well, to take up the question, can the planet be saved? It's a pleasure to welcome both Robert Manne and Archbishop Philip Freier. Robert Manne, perhaps I could come to you. One of the most difficult presenting issues in Australia, particularly, seems to be the consistent scepticism on the question of whether the planet is in trouble. And the question is usually phrased as whether you believe in climate change. The term belief implies a certain subjectivity not usually associated with matters scientific.
Yes, I mean, the scientists who are interested in climate came to a consensual, there were some dissidents, but a consensual conclusion early 1990s probably. Then work began in the United States by many of the corporations, but also by the libertarian conservative think tanks to cast doubt on the science in a way that was very similar to the question of tobacco and smoking. And that work, the work of the corporations and then the think tanks and the conservative outfits, has been remarkably successful. You now have in United States, but also Australia, Canada, Britain, not much in Europe or elsewhere, a very significant opinion that suggests that 97% of climate scientists have been surveyed 4 times are wrong, and that in fact this is a kind of conspiracy of scientists to create world government. And so skepticism about the question is now very general in English-speaking democracies, and it's one of the really difficult problems we face, in that in general science has great authority in Western societies, and in Australia and America it does, but in this case 20 years of political work has had its effect. You have, for example, the Republican Party in the United States, which is almost 100% denialist, an extraordinary situation which I think is putting the planet in peril, because the United States is still the most important political country in the world.
Archbishop Philip Freier, you're somebody who, growing up through your own career and your own academic background, had some interest in science as well as being a theologian. It reminds one in the religious arena of those somewhat frustrating and pointless debates over creation versus evolution that took place in the 1920s in the United States. What role does religion play in a debate like this?
Well, I think religion's a powerful motivator for people, and I think to cast things as a matter of principle, whether one holds as a matter of belief or not, can in certain kinds of societal contexts give some privilege to that position. So I think that it's probably unhelpful to cast this as simply a matter of opinion or belief, because I think that it's an area of life where the research that I've seen indicates that there is not a relationship between more information and people coming to have different views. It's a sort of paradox that the more information people have presented to them, the more they become cemented in their views. And this is research that's been developed by a Yale scholar, Daniel Kahan, who looks at this question. And it occurs certainly in the US, it occurs in Australia and in other sorts of societies where, as Robert's saying, that the politics of the matter, the politics and the principles and the beliefs behind that political idea, really, they become the biggest driver. In most areas of life, the more information we have, the more we are convinced of a position. But in this and some other ones, the more information people have, the more they are cemented in a polarised view. So it is a paradox, and I don't think it's an easy matter because of that to convince people by adducing more facts.
We've got to dig ourselves out of that in some way. So how deep, Robert Manne, is that problem, that you tend to drift towards your own interest group or your own peer groups when those questions of real existential "what do I do?" And you feel uncertain?
What the Archbishop was talking about was the work of Kahn is, I think, the most plausible explanation. He calls it cultural cognition. And in essence, what the argument is that people, in a way, know that they can't themselves determine scientific questions of risk. So they look towards the commentators, the politicians, even the scientists who they trust. And so what happens is that rather than me deciding that I know what is true about climate science, I look towards the people I trust, the commentators and politicians. And so what happens is that if there is the creation of a kind of idea of a narrative of dispute and dueling between scientists, conservative kind of people look towards their team, Rush Limbaugh or Donald Trump, and liberal people look towards Obama or look towards the liberal television. I don't know. Kahn himself, who's a very distinguished social scientist, doesn't know how you break that down. It doesn't happen, say, in Germany because there doesn't exist any contention. You have to create a sense of contention among scientists, which is what this 20 years of the denialist movement achieved in the United States and spread very successfully to Australia. Incidentally, the CSIRO has shown that Australia is at least as polarised now, if not slightly more, than the United States. A remarkable achievement for the denialist movement. And I honestly think unless a sort of catastrophe occurs, it's going to be very difficult now in these societies to break scepticism. And scepticism is, as it were, the moderate version of denialism amongst the true believing denialists.
Let's look at some of the other factors which may influence that as well. There has also been a move over the last 30 years, perhaps, to say that the way problems are to be addressed in the world is to not think in terms of big institutions, because big institutions can generate their own sorts of internal corruptions and tensions. The best way to do it is get out of the way, let the markets run things, let a way of doing things prevail which just let things be. And the role of government is just to ensure that letting things be gets on. Now, that seems to add to what you're saying, another level again.
Yeah. I mean, I don't agree with everything Naomi Klein says in her book, This Changes Everything. But one point she makes, which is fundamentally important, is that unhappily, neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, which you're describing, occurred and triumphed exactly at the historical moment when scientists realised that capitalism, economies, had created inadvertently a potentially catastrophic situation for the future of not only humans but other species. She calls it bad timing. So at a precise moment when market fundamentalism, again mainly but not only in the English-speaking democracies, triumphed politically, was precisely the time when government intervention, massive government intervention, was required. And again, we don't know how to break that. We live in a world created by essentially Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, the Chicago School. Those are the ideas that now dominate, even though most people aren't aware of the economists. And the ideas of John Maynard Keynes have gone into a kind of a second order. And I don't know how to break out of this, because neoliberalism, which says, as you say, the market can determine things for us and governments should take a back seat, is a disaster when it comes to what will be massive regulation, massive intervention, massive spending by government to try and overcome this problem.
And John, can I just perhaps comment that I think we're involved in something from the perspective of what our human life's length is compared to things which have a longer runtime. It's very hard for any of us to have a perspective of what part of a change we're in. Like, I think, people who were hunting thylacines in Tasmania, did they actually think they were there to make them extinct forever? Probably not. They thought they were doing something which was a familiar, useful thing to stop something preying on sheep and chickens. Did the people who started deforestation in sub-Saharan Africa think they were going to advance the onset of the desert, in that and many other areas. Of course not. They just were going about the normal things that they thought they did to sustain their life. So I think that there's a question of perspective in this. We do the things that we think and intuitively experience as beneficial. We live in a technological society where we are generally very optimistic about technology, the capacity of finding a technological solution. Our mindset in the Western world is like that. And I think there's probably many people here today. If you say, well, there's a problem, well, it's maybe because we're not putting enough money into clever engineers and researchers coming up with a solution. There must be an engineered solution, and indeed, possibly things could be proposed. But I think that we've got a difficulty, and I think this is where perhaps some of the things we might come on to with the discussion of a bigger picture of things emerges, that we are fundamentally fairly limited in our humanness, in the span of our human life, when we try and engage in things which are way beyond that runtime.
We've developed institutions over the last 1,000 years or so designed to deal with exactly that. That is, to conserve the capacity to think long-term over time. Universities are one such example. The church is another example of how you have an institution designed to say, take the longer view. What is the purpose of life? How do we live the good life? What is the role of community? Over the last 30 years, we've also seen a decline, in some areas a rapid decline, of those sorts of community institutions. If not a decline, a morphing into something quite different. So, do you see, from the point of view of religious leadership, the capacity, what do you think of the capacity of those institutions to any longer deliver to a wider audience? That it's not just the institutions, but the very idea of authority has taken quite a pounding.
Oh, and I think there's clearly a compartmentalisation of things, and often, if we say something is, people who are here today, they hear something being said as a moral matter, it's often used in the way, well, that trumps every other matter, rather than the morality, the science, the sociology, the economics, all those circumstances go into different aspects of the reality of human life and society, and we probably need to understand all of them in interrelationships. So often, we flip-flop a bit between these atomised views of thinking there's only, one way of looking at it, and I think you're right. I think that the leadership of other aspects of decision-making in society runs the risk of being diminished. And I think the earlier fact that this in the Western world can be put as a matter of just opinion or just belief or just matter of apparent political consensus means that the actual duration of any policy, as we've seen in Australia, is far too small with the political cycle to have any effect on matters at all. So I think there's a risk in that. I mean, Obama is showing a commitment going into Paris, but then will that commitment be carried on in the next executive in the US? It's very hard to say.
We've had a major intervention in the last couple of months, and it's come from the church. Pope Francis, his encyclical Laudato Si, seems to inherently recognise the sorts of contradictions we've been talking about. And he's given a view in that climate encyclical which attempts to do a holistic, look, this is a whole world issue. This is about economic development in the third world as much as it is about what's happening to temperatures in Australia or somewhere else. Here is a genuine attempt to get a big picture view out. Robert Manne, perhaps I could ask you first. How significant a game changer, perhaps, is Laudato Si? And it's not just that the Pope is saying something, it's that somebody is game to get out with a big picture view and say, this is intelligible and understandable to everyone.
Yeah, well, we don't know yet how big a game changer it is. I would say it's the Pope's intervention, I'll call it as a secular person, is the most important since Al Gore. And I think Al Gore was fundamental in raising consciousness in the West. We don't know, I think the Pope has a deeper reading of the looming problem than Al Gore. Al Gore essentially believes that we just have to have, as the Archbishop was saying, a technological solution, have to get rid of fossil fuels, for energy, find renewable energy. The Pope is trying to say, I think, that there's something more fundamental. He says at a certain point in the encyclical that for 200 years we have treated our common home, as he calls it, with disregard. And we are a reckless, and not only a generation, a reckless, as it were, period of human history, era. And in a way, the 200 years is industrialism. He thinks that industrialism has created great things. He says no one can look at a skyscraper without seeing its beauty. No one cannot see the wonders of technology and how they've, as it were, given to the world. But we also have now reached a situation where the industrialization of the world is causing a threat to our relationship to other species and to the natural world. And so his is a call for a profound rethinking of the relationship between human beings and the natural world in which they live. And it's just, the as it were, sharpest point of this crisis is that no one really knew that burning fuel, burning oil, burning gas was going to lead to the potential for, essentially, in 100 years, if it continues, a ruined planet. The planet won't care. The planet goes on happily. But the human beings and the species that live upon it, for whom now we are a sort of custodia, it's going to matter enormously. So he's calling, and he uses the word, which is a profound word, a cultural revolution, which is in part our relationship to nature, the natural world, and in part our relationship to inequality. Because he thinks, and this is, I think, undoubtedly true, that as the crisis of climate moves through, it will be the poor that suffer most. They'll suffer most in societies like ours, but even more in the third world, or as it used to be called.
You can see, Archbishop Philip Freier, why this, from the Pope's point of view, is not just a scientific question, but at heart, a deeply theological question, because it goes to the very meaning of creation. How much, I know power is the wrong word, but how much capacity does that release for institutions such as churches and other bodies to take hold of this and reinsert themselves back into the debate about the fundamentals of civil society, what we are here for? I mean, for many years, churches have been gradually migrating to the margins. In some ways, it seems to many people it was self-inflicted. Churches basically decided, let's get out of the public sphere and look after our own private space.
Well, I think that lack of diversity of opinion is not helpful. I've made some comments recently because I think there are we are in a way wanting to go down this pathway I said earlier of atomization, of seeing things. Let's keep it simple. Let's find a simple narrative of analysis, rather than there might be some difficult clashes of perspective. People might be speaking in ways almost across each other, but it's worth attending to the different kinds of discourses, because there will be different aspects about the human reality that are carried forward into a decision from a whole range of perspectives, including theological and religious perspectives from a range of traditions. And I think that's what the Pope is saying in Laudato Si. He's certainly bringing and I think integrating his experience in Latin America, the experience of the Catholic Church, having to have a very important and deep intellectual engagement with Marxism and its critique of the imbalance of wealth and poverty in society. And he picks up some very long biblical traditions that go back thousands of years, that really the quality of a society and the quality of human life can be seen through the lens of the most disadvantaged, through the poor. And I think that if you look at that and you say that if you have a theological and a principle belief that God wants everyone to flourish, it is impossible. I think he's saying that everyone in the world can enjoy a first world lifestyle, depending as it is on the energy that we need from non-renewable resources. And I think there were some figures I saw in the paper the other day that the average Australian consumes something like about 60 times as much energy as an average Bangladeshi.
Absolutely.
And so, what is a good life for that Bangladeshi? Is it for them to suddenly use 60 times more energy than they're using now, or is it for the Western industrial countries to have a much more accelerated pattern of reducing our reliance on non-renewable resources because of the carbon pollution and carbon dioxide emission issues. And I think that's underneath a lot of the thinking about our theological perspective to that.
John, can I slightly disagree with just one thing
Please.
that the Archbishop said? I don't think that Pope Francis's concern with radical inequality between different parts of the world within our own societies is Marxism. In a way, I think the fact that you've called it Marxism is a kind of victory of neoliberalism in our discourse. It seems to me the concern for radical inequality is much deeper than Marxism, and I think you'd find it in many religious traditions and in many secular ethical traditions. And I don't read the encyclical as in any way a Marxist or quasi-Marxist document because it is a deeply spiritual and anti-materialist document. It is to do with, it is a concern with the human spirit and the relationship of the human spirit to the natural world. And I think, I used to be editor of Quadrant. I don't think I'm a Marxist. But I have never thought that the issue of radical inequality, which has got worse over time in our sorts of societies, is a Marxist matter. I think it's a matter of both secular and religious ethics.
I think that's true, but I think it's also true that broadly in societies like we live in, there's been a very profound dominance of a neoliberal solution to issues, and something which Pope Francis criticises is that markets by themselves are not a magical means of redistribution. So he is focusing on, that was all my point was really, on some of the categories of the Marxist critique of inequality. And because he's come out of a context where he's had to engage quite deeply with that in Argentina, I think he's bringing some ideas and some language into that discourse, which does sound very fresh to Western ears.
Oh yeah, no,
because that was really what my point was.
But the great the most, I think, powerful critique of neoliberalism comes from the contemporary Keynesians in the United States, like Joseph Stiglitz or Paul Krugman. So anyhow, it's a small point, but I do think that we shouldn't think of a concern with radical inequality as somehow within a Marxist frame.
But I think one of the points he makes is, he says decisions about things which seem instrumental are in fact decisions about the kind of society we have. And I think that's an important insight, that we are making a whole lot of decisions which seem to be in a way neutral about the good or bad on other people, but many decisions, they have effects on people, and we've had discussions here in this same context about our, trade policy. What's our policies in this country that relate to imports versus employment here and those things. So I think we're not very alert to the instrumental decisions we make and what impact they have on the kind of society we live in. And I think at its heart, it's proper for him as a Christian leader to be really concerned about the kind of society we have. I would welcome more engagement by people of faith in that kind of debate and contribution to society.
And he's opened that possibility up. And it seems to me, from what you're saying, Robert, that he's done it not just for religious institutions. He's, by virtue of where he sits and who he is, he's opened the discussion up again for ordinary people and other institutions to pick up a coherent view.
Absolutely. I read it. In a way, I think it's the best thing that's been written on the crisis of climate. And I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a religious Jew. I'm Jewish by kind of ethnicity, history. I read it as a secular person, so it is an open document. Can I, just one thing, you were talking about institutions before, and there's one thing that I think we should add to this because I think it's fundamental. There is one institution that we don't have as we've evolved, which is international institutions with authority to, as it were, shape the decisions of national governments. And that's the institution we're lacking. There is, the one thing that, if there's any discussion of climate, it ought to be accepted that it is a problem more difficult in terms of our institutions than any we've previously seen. And the reason is, and this, the economists say this, and they use game theory, there is no way Australia can make a contribution in cutting fossil fuels which will benefit just Australians. And because it's a completely global problem, the atmosphere is global, what we can do is only to the general good, it's not to the particular good. And so it's what the economists call the problem of the free rider. If a country acts altruistically and really savagely tries to cut down on its own fossil fuels, it will benefit everyone but not itself. And so the arguments of those who oppose action is Australia can be, utterly kind of altruistic in its behaviour, but it won't benefit the Australian people. It'll benefit everyone in a tiny way. And that's a problem we've never had to cope before. We don't have international institutions with the authority to command national governments to do things that require sacrifice. And that makes it a uniquely difficult problem for us.
Hence you have the illustration of the last couple of days of the Australian Conservation Foundation and the Adani coal mine, and that argument, or a mirror of that argument, is being played out in the reason they're taking the court case.
Yes.
This goes to the real question that the Pope has a singular advantage in that the Catholic Church still sees itself as a global institution and can work to mediate those discussions, but of course it doesn't affect the economic balance in each state. But let me introduce for a moment another question that comes out of accepting perhaps the holistic view the Catholic Church says of something. It too has a weakness here, and it's last week on Q&A, Paul Ehrlich made the observation when talking about the refugee crisis, that is, can we any longer consider national borders ethical? That is, why are we making a decision based on the borders that people are crossing? And he's alluding there to this mass movement of people, which climate change may exacerbate in other areas. And of course, you have the other question that Paul Ehrlich raised back in 1968, the population bomb. And here is where some say, well, the Church has been a contributor to that one.
Yeah, well, I would agree. I think that that's a weakness of the encyclical, and I think that where population is mentioned, it's pretty quickly dismissed as a tool of people who don't really want to pursue the analysis further. So I think that population is a significant issue, and I wouldn't share the Pope's perspective of dismissing that off the table too quickly. But I think that the broader issue about the survival of what are the international means of structuring global society? I mean, I've grown up in areas most people have here of thinking that national entities, national borders were fairly fixed kind of things. You looked at a map, they looked like they could manage things, but I think that there's a whole lot of reasons to question that perspective. Do nations have the capacity of operating together in such a way? Do nations even have the same enduring capacity of controlling the lands which are in their borders? And we've seen some places, certainly through Africa and the Middle East, where that seems quite questionable. You're then left with some of the international institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and I think that they probably have lacked a bigger picture moral ethic. I think they've been, in some places, very much working on a neoliberal philosophy which has highly disadvantaged Indigenous people and people who were the poor peasants, the landowners of places where dams and other things have been brought in. So I think that if we don't just want to lapse into chaos, which much of this discussion has looming as a cloud somewhere over it, either an environmental chaos or a social chaos. We need to work, I think quite intentionally, to build the kind of institutions whereby some of these big questions can be tackled. And anyhow, the post-Second World War institutional structure of the world does not look profoundly robust to do that.
Even this morning you have...
Can I say something about your question? Again, it's slightly different from the Archbishop. in political science and in social science, there's a lot of discussion of globalization. It was the idea that the nation state was losing its bite and that global institutions and NGOs were taking over. I think that's wrong. I think the nation state has lost a lot of its capacity to control economies, which have been globalized. But the more that happens, the more intent they are on maintaining other forms of control. And we see it in the asylum seeker debate here, but we see it all over the world. I also, if I didn't watch Q&A, but if Paul Ehrlich said that, I just don't agree that somehow the nation state is, from an ethical point of view, irrelevant, because we live in communities and we have traditions which we care about. And if the nation state erodes, loses its capacity, then communities, traditions, cultures also lose their capacities. And so I feel, ethically speaking, the hope to hang on to a bounded community and culture and tradition matters. And insofar as the left suggests it doesn't matter, they will, as it were, be feeding, I think, ugly forms of the right, because I don't think people want to live in a world without boundedness. The trouble is the boundedness, which I think matters culturally, traditionally, is a kind of disaster when it comes to this particular crisis, climate, where we have to think beyond our boundaries and think of the general or public good.
Let me just ask a question that's in the general air, but not necessarily tied to this question, but it goes to the point you're raising, and that is, we've seen a discussion in the public sphere over the nature of politics in the last few months, thrown up by the American presidential elections and the election of Jeremy Corbyn to lead the British Labor Party and Bernie Sanders on the left of the American debate at the moment. And there seems to be almost a recognition in the commentary on that people are hungry. There is an intuitive recognition that the structures aren't working, and desire to get back into that sort of discussion that has to do with ultimate questions about who are we and what are we doing, not the instrumental question about can I afford to buy a new cappuccino machine. Are those signs of hope for you, Philip Freier, even if those examples are on the extremes of the political debate?
Whether they're hopeful signs, I think time will tell, but I think that there is always a yearning within us, which is for a deeper integration. There is a yearning that I think we all have to live in a society where we can enjoy the things we have without the persistent guilt that that's at the cost of someone else. I think there's some pretty fundamental things that come out of human empathy that are part of our God-givenness, our human nature, in a theological description, that we are always restless about until they find their right kind of balance and harmony. So the fact that people are restless and looking for something different doesn't shock me at all. The long narrative of the Judeo-Christian theology really is that people run the risk of finding it in false gods, in idols, in things which are very much transitory, part of the createdness of God, not the creator. And
we've spent too long with the golden calf. We're about to return to the mountain.
I think we're always prone to looking for a small thing, and the small thing could be bigger than us, but a small thing, and divinizing it that makes us feel assured in our perspective. And I think that a theological critique of human life is always about critiquing the smallness of our vision and inviting us to a bigger picture, and that releases our empathy, which is a human giftedness about the concern for others.
Bernie Sanders actually took up the challenge a few weeks ago and went to the university, which should be the sort of bellwether of the religious right in the United States, Liberty University. And he said to the students at Liberty University, I'm a secular Jew, and from your point of view, a socialist, yet leaving aside the things we differ, let me talk to you about the things we share in common. And he actually got a good reaction from that student body, which is remarkable given the polarisation and the way that game's been played in the United States over recent years. Robert Manne, do you see hopefulness in those sorts of...
I do. I mean, I do also think that the United States and the United Kingdom are in a different situation from us. I don't think, a Corbyn or a Bernie Sanders is a conceivable figure in Australian politics, and that's partly to do with small things, but partly to do with the radical inequality that is seen in the United Kingdom and the United States. I mean, an astonishing fact recently is that white American males are beginning to die earlier than they used to. It's almost the only country amongst the developed world where that's happening, and people are beginning to compare it to the late period of the Soviet Union, where the mortality rate went lowered. There is, I think, actually one of the boons, I didn't used to think this, but I now think, one of the boons we had is that the deregulation of the Australian economy was done by a Labor government, and the safety net and the welfare state has not been nearly so under threat, and the radical inequality is not nearly so advanced in our society as it is in Britain and the United States. And I see Corbyn and Sanders, neither of whom will become the leaders of their countries, as symptoms of a real kind of explosion of anger at what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years in those societies. And also, everyone looking at America sees that the political system is more or less broken, that money controls things. And again, there's an element of that here, but nothing like the extent of the United States.
We're seeing there perhaps incipient signs of hope, that just as there was perhaps a shift 40 years ago that led to Margaret Thatcher being able to say there's no such thing as society, or Ronald Reagan saying government is the problem, to perhaps this crisis of the climate is forming part of the essential background of that. We've been pretty pessimistic, but here surely you're seeing begins with Laudato Si coming out, and you see the reactions about other institutions and their inadequacy in society, that this debate is going to be part of what begins to shift the ground. Now, one can't be too optimistic about that, but there are signs there that this discussion is beginning.
Look, this kind of thing is not going to be determined by debates. It's going to be determined by whether or not there is action. We've got maybe 20 years to take real action. It's physics. And people are now hoping that Paris will produce something that Kyoto didn't produce. I'm extremely doubtful that that's the case. I think the idea that countries can pledge that they'll do something by 2030, and we believe that they will do it because we want to hope, the decisions are not going to be made by Bernie Sanders, by changes in opinion, even by the encyclical. It's going to be done by whether the world can become sober and serious enough, quickly enough, and altruistically enough, it has to be said, to do something that's never been done before in history, which is to sacrifice current well-being and to go through an energy revolution which will be as large or larger than the mobilisation that societies had to do to fight the Second World War. As large or larger. There's a lot of fantasy that it's a reasonably easy thing to move from fossil fuels to renewables, or maybe to nuclear, go back to nuclear or go to nuclear. It's not easy. The people that write about this best are the academics who write on energy economics. I'm reading one at the moment. And they know this is a massive revolution, probably as big as the Industrial Revolution. We live in a fossil fuel society. Without fossil fuels, the well-being that has happened since late 18th century, 19th century is inconceivable. So I don't think opinion or religious leaders or Bernie Sanders are critical. What's critical is a radical coming to sense of world leaders across the globe. And the present phase is one of kind of uniform hopefulness. Everyone's finding hope in this or that or that. But the problem we're facing is of extremity, of an extremity that, in my view, never before in human history has anything like it occurred, which is that in 100 years, if we don't go through a revolution in our economy, moving entirely away from fossil fuels, we will destroy the planet. And I don't want to leave this occasion without being able to say that that's how large a thing this is.
Philip Freier, your job is signs of hope.
Look, I think there's always hopefulness, but I think that the reality is likely to be that if things continue as they are, some people will probably continue to live comfortably and happily, but more people will live without that comfort and happiness. And I think that the perspective, which goes back to my earlier comment about the perspective we have, is often too small to imagine that. It's very hard for us to imagine the second, the third, the fourth generation after us. And do we want a society where people who are our descendants, people who will take our places in a place like Australia, will actually be living in a society which is quite degraded, much more unsustainable, and a world where there is far greater certainty just with some of the climate change scenarios, the areas of the earth which remain sustainably habitable for the size populations that they have now, that they become uninhabitable or for only fewer people. So will people survive on Earth? I think people will survive on Earth, but can we survive in the kind of numbers with the kind of expectations of comfort and affluence that we have in our present Western society? I think not. So I think that it is a call for some radical action and some urgent change, but clearly there will be some people, and you can probably project it through as long as you like, who will have the means to think that if they're unconcerned about other humans suffering and inequality, they might be quite content about their own lives. And it won't be those people who have the militancy for the kind of change we're talking about.
Well, on that bleak but penetrating observation, perhaps it's time to ask our audience for your observations about the critical questions as you see them. Perhaps if you see signs of hope, where are they? How do you read the crisis from your perspective? And questions that you can put to our panellists.
David Schutz from the Catholic Church, and I won't preach a sermon, but I'll ask a question about a phrase that Pope Francis uses in Laudato Si', the human ecology. Both of you touched on it. Robert talked about a more fundamental approach than technological solutions. Archbishop Philip referred to human flourishing, but Pope Francis's idea of human ecology involves more along the lines of those human realities that are denied, things like marriage and family, sexual identity, right to life for the unborn and the elderly, and it's in that context that he talked about population growth. So how do you see the relationship between the natural ecology and the human ecology?
Well, it's probably more for the Archbishop to answer than me, but what struck me in reading, as a secular person reading the encyclical, was that one of the elements was the sense that despite our material well-being in Western societies, there's a great deal of deep unhappiness, of anxiety, of drug dependency, of marriage breakdown. And in a way, it reminded me of a lot of the best kind of contemporary sociology, which also thinks that we've reached a state of society in which material well-being has not led to human flourishing, to use the Archbishop's term. So that I think that this is why I thought the encyclical was so interesting, in that he's trying to integrate a sense of breakdown of society to the more general question of the crisis of industrial civilization, and doing it in a way that I think is very compatible with a lot of the best contemporary sociology. My favourite is a man called Zygmunt Bauman, but there are many other sociologists who have deep understanding of the way in which certain kinds of links between human beings and communities has broken down under conditions of radical individualism and radical neoliberalism.
But I think it is about a deep interconnectedness that we have with each other, with the world, that we're being alerted to. And I think that's what really I was taking out of that there's this kind of deep interconnectedness that means that we aren't sort of autonomous beings that can just sort of float around the place, happen to have a personal satisfaction of life without us really integrating all of the impacts that our life has personally, socially, intergenerationally, and with the natural world. And I think that we've been often brought into that radically atomized way of understanding, and I think that the conception of human ecology, which is about the deep interconnectedness, is a very good thing for us to be alerted to.
Thank you very much. Leonie Bird, Holy Trinity Q. We talked about corporatisation and multinational corporations and the nation state. What do you think of the idea that, in fact, many of these multinational corporations have to be based in a nation state, and in fact that it may be the extension of influence, primarily economically, of, say, larger powers, United States of America, China, the economic powerhouses? Nation states are really exerting influence through those multinational corporations, and in fact that the nation state, both overtly and covertly, is exerting its influence far more than we realise. And we see that recently in the disputes over the South China Sea. That's essentially a nation-state conflict, and it's going to reverberate through the rest of the world. What do you say about that so-called dichotomy between the nation-state and corporatisation, that in fact they could be both one and the same thing?
Well, some corporations, and the Chinese ones, are entirely within the frame of a nation-state, almost entirely. Others, the big oil companies, I think are often more powerful than many nation-states. I think many nation-states would find it hard to take them on, so I don't think there's one or the other. I think I would like to say about the corporations that matter in terms of climate change essentially are those that are searching for fossil fuels. Many nation-states don't have the power really to reject their power. And I want to say something which is slightly different, which is, in my view, the most grotesque aspect of what I call really existing contemporary capitalism, the corporations, is that no nation-state has yet stood up to them and said, you will not go on searching for that which is destroying the planet. They have not said to Adani, the Australian government, leave the coal in the ground in the Galilee Basin. They've not really said even to the Russians are going to get into the Arctic to find oil if they can. It's hard to do. They can do it because the Arctic is melting because of climate change. But governments have not yet had the power or the capacity or the will to say to the large corporations, either those like the Chinese, which are essentially national ones, or the multinational ones, they've not said to them, we know that 80% of known reserves of fossil fuels have to be left in the ground, and you will not be given the license by us to search for them. It's the most grotesque situation. I wrote recently that if an intelligent Martian came to Earth, learnt about our climate problem, they would think the human race is insane. How come you're looking for more coal when you already know that coal is destroying your environment, your planet, your home? And that, I think, and so on the question of corporations, we have an incredible problem because of the privilege that neoliberalism has given to the corporations, that they can more or less do as they wish.
I'd probably just like to approach that from the sense of looking at the role in global structures, global institutions of the role of virtue for leaders of corporations. I think probably everyone's been shocked by the revelation of VW seeking, or someone in the VW corporation seeking to deceive testing of emissions, and a complicated way of that happening. Now, to me, somewhere, there's people who failed in their own virtue, responsibility, their own ethical sense of what they're doing. And I think when that failure is evident, it's a profound failure. But equally, I think if we're looking at what does the world look like in the future, the role of corporations is not going to diminish quickly, and I think the importance in valuing ethical leadership and virtuous leadership of those corporations which might want to transition out of some of the things we're talking about into more sustainable and renewable forms of energy, how those corporations can influence government policy, because I think that we can see that governments are very much influenced by that. So I think that there's a positive role for virtuous leadership in the corporate world, and I'd really welcome our attention on that and our nurturing and valuing of that kind of virtue.
There's a problem, however, because the way corporations are structured, their primary responsibility is to their shareholders, to make money. And insofar as that is their primary responsibility, the virtuous members of those corporations find themselves in a bind. There's an extremely good book recently written by two Sydney academics about this question, by Christopher Wright and Daniel Nyberg, which shows that many people working in the corporations are virtuous in entirely your ways. In the end, many of them leave the corporations because they hit a wall. They're thought of as zealots and ideologues, and in the end, the simple fact is that the corporations have a duty, a legal responsibility to make profit. And there's a very big problem in the way corporations are legally structured.
Yeah. And I think that's the issue that's being raised. Really, you have, in a way, weak government, which is comparatively weak to regulate and punish aberration from corporations. And so, the normal means we kind of have of government being a regulator of conduct and encouraging something which is socially responsible and virtuous often breaks down because of the comparative imbalance of size.
Gerald O'Collins, I was very glad to see the three of you stressing the polarisation that's there. I mean, people are polarised about what's true, what are the facts. They're polarised about what's good, what's the right thing to do. One theme in the encyclical might be a help here. It's the theme of beauty, right from the beginning, that the virtuous thing is a beautiful thing. And the Pope's concerned about turning the planet into a rubbish dump. Creating deserts, cutting down forests is an ugly thing to do. And maybe, the debate is so stuck at the level of what's true and what's good, it might be helpful to move it a bit towards what's beautiful and what's ugly, that making the planet a rubbish dump is a very ugly thing to do, and virtue is beautiful. And the bigger picture is the Archbishop spoke of is the beautiful picture. So maybe, in that golden thread that runs through the encyclical of the pursuit of beauty, there may be something that can move people, maybe even move some leaders of governments.
Do we take that as a comment, or do you wish to pick
I
up the threads of that?
I think it's a powerful observation, because I think it's about us understanding again what a complete human life is like. What is a person fully alive in all of their faculties, their aesthetic, their moral, their empathetic faculties? And I think that's the view of human flourishing that comes out of the Christian tradition, out of the longer Judeo-Christian scriptural tradition, one probably shared by other people, and how we enliven that to engage that kind of what I'd probably describe as a moral sense as is integrated with the issues of our society is very profound. But just as we reflect on this day when the First World War ceased, you can see something which was something like a war that went on for years, entirely in human hands. Humans had the ability to stop it any day of the week. Could have stopped it after a week, they could have stopped it after a month, but a certain chaos reigns, a certain sort of dullness of a moral empathy sets in, and people shut off a whole concern, and some awful thing that we now look back on that war and endless other wars and think, well, how could people be there and let that happen? But people did. And I think there's something peculiar about the human person in that a societal value, we can invest in societal values that actually shut down some of the things that we're speaking about. We'll actually endure ugliness and destruction and that natural giftedness to admire beauty and the aesthetics and to see it flourish is almost cut off. And I think we've got to be alert to that, because to me that's a diminished human life, and we need to attend to what a full human life is about, which will alert us to the resurgence of that golden thread of beauty through things.
Yes.
And if I can just very quickly, I completely agree with that comment, and I'm profoundly moved, particularly by young people who entirely understand what a destruction of the natural world means and who are putting their bodies on the line in regard to that. And it's happening in Australia when, grotesquely, coal mines are being planned for beautiful areas of agricultural land, and many, we've even got the hero of rugby union, David Pocock, who changed himself to tractors or to excavators or whatever when he takes time off rugby, because he perceives the beauty that is under destruction and under threat. And it is one of our hopes that the sense of the destruction of the beautiful will mobilise very large numbers of the younger generation who have most to lose.
I would just like to ask John Poppins from High Street Road Uniting Church about the views of the panel on the way in which it's the young people Robert refers to, underfunded NGOs, which are themselves being attacked by government, and corporations working almost in collusion with each other. I particularly observe in the Latrobe Valley, where I farm in a small way, the clash between the coal seam gas and coal interests, and a rising tide of local resistance, the same in the Hunter Valley, same issues appearing in South America, in places like BHP's coal mines, for example. It seems to be that much of the resistance is from the grossly underfunded and the poor communities, and perhaps that's our hope. Would you like to comment, please?
And just an observation on that. It's interesting that those upwelling, say from the Hunter Valley, are crossing traditional political lines. They're completely smashing what's seen as the traditional power structures for politics.
Yeah, I mean, Naomi Klein, again, if I can quote her, calls it blockadia. She sees as a virtual country across the globe of people mobilising against the devastation of the earth. And sometimes they have success, but I don't want to romanticise the degree of success. When I was recently in the States, there was a lot of young people, incredibly brave, in kayaks trying to prevent a Shell vessel going to the Arctic. And Shell has given up its ambitions in the Arctic temporarily, maybe, permanently maybe, lost $7 billion, so it's said. But I pay homage to those young, brave Americans at Seattle who, in kayaks, as a symbolic gesture, were trying to prevent the passage of the Shell vessel to go to the Arctic. And all over the world, in blockadia, as Naomi Klein calls it, things like that are happening. And that does give hope, because that is not only human spirit, but courage and a sense of love of the world. But there are incredible forces against that. You know, you talked about the First World War. There were D.H. Lawrence, thought it was an obscenity, but he was more or less drummed out of his country.
Yes, you had your hand up for a while.
There we go.
Howard Hutchins. I'm a follower of Christ. I believe in God. I wouldn't say I was a golden God botherer, but I'm also a disciple of Professor Ian Plimer, a skeptic and a scientific skeptic. I believe this CO2 is a nonsense, but that's my democratic right. Now, having said that, have any of you ever considered in the 3% of dissenting scientists, you may have a bunch of modern-day Galileos?
Of course you may. There's one, I think, really distinguished scientist who's a skeptic, Richard Lindzen. I actually think Blymer is ridiculous, but Richard Lindzen, everyone in the area thinks is a serious scientist, and he has a theory that cloud cover may negate the effects of CO2. And it's a miracle might happen, and that the 97% of scientists might be wrong. And the fact that the Earth continues to warm up and the oceans continue to acidify might not be a sign of things to come. But would you take the risk that they are the new Galileo? Because if they're not the new Galileo, the planet is destroyed. And it seems to me such an astonishingly irresponsible attitude to take. Blymer is a geologist, he's not a climate scientist. If you want to read a devastating review of his book by a real climate scientist, Google The Australian for the Michael Ashton review of it. And I think anyhow, that to take a risk that there is a Galileo amongst this 3%, and if there isn't, the Earth will be destroyed, is the most utterly irresponsible attitude to take. And I would ask you to change your mind. Because it doesn't matter that you think it, it does matter that 50% of Americans think something like that. That really matters.
And I think it does. There is an issue here, isn't there? But subjectively, every time we go and seek some health treatment, we'll usually be more assured that we have the consensus of an intervention that will be medically helpful for us than there might be someone somewhere who has a dissenting view, because undoubtedly there is. If you go on the internet, I'm sure you can find a whole bunch of dissenting views as to why the medical treatment you might be having you shouldn't have and do something else. But most of us will be very convinced by the attested consensus, and I don't see how that changes when we start looking at a bigger issue like this.
Except it's only your body that's at stake. Not
Yeah,
the
Yes,
Earth.
here
That's the
in the centre,
Yeah.
the gentleman in the centre there, yes.
Thank you. My name is Bernard Wheelahan. I take Professor Manne's comments with great satisfaction, sir. Thank you for your observations. Australia is in a unique position. Our east coast is on a raft of coal, our west coast is in a sea of gas, and the middle contains mountains of uranium. We're the most energy intensive of developed economies, and most of that energy comes from fossil fuels. When you said that we need a cultural shift, an absolute revolution in how we replace this energy, you went on to say how big that task is, and indeed oil is the biggest business physically and financially in the world. We've had some small victories here. The renewable energy target has been retained against all odds. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation has been kept. The carbon tax, ludicrously and regrettably, has been demolished completely. What are the energy economists saying, sir, about what is the solution? I hear what you say, stop exploring. What do you do for an encore?
Well, I'm just reading one at the moment who's quite a conservative economist, Dieter Helm from Oxford. He thinks that wind and solar will always be small beer and won't have the capacity. He actually, I mean, for what it's worth, thinks that you need gas for a while. Gas is much less polluting than coal to keep the electricity supply going. And I don't know whether I agree or not with him, he thinks that we can have renewable energy of a different kind if massive amounts of research and development go into it. That's one view. Another brilliant energy analyst, Václav Smil, says one of the things we have to do is to decide to reduce our energy consumption radically. He thinks that Westerners use a grotesque amount of energy, and we need to become a society which doesn't rely on energy to the same extent. To be honest, I think most people are in the dark. Some people think we can go to nuclear, but many of the energy economists think it's not going to be viable, it's too expensive. Anyhow, uranium will run out at a certain point, so on. I'm not an energy expert, I read a lot. I'm not sure. And one of the hopeful things is that the cost of solar has gone down radically, and battery technology is improving very radically. I think if carbon price was put in, really severe carbon price, there would be technologies that would emerge if they were profitable, and they may not yet be known. So really we're all in the dark. But the one thing that I'm absolutely convinced about is that it's a massive task, and not something that can be, to think that solar and wind and so on is relatively easy matter, because I know it's not. And I know that societies are not going to give up their current incredible affluence. We live in a way that human beings 200 years ago would not have imagined, even remotely possible, even for kings. We live in the most astonishingly comfortable way, not happier, but we live materially more comfortably, and I don't believe that our sort of society is going to give that away. It might be forced to give it away by the climate, but it won't voluntarily give it away. So in a way the hope is renewable technology that yet doesn't exist, I think.
I think Chris is just going to wrap up.
Look, can I just, we've run out of time, but let me ask just one final observation from you both. Given that we're all struggling in the dark here, Robert Manne, as you so eloquently stated, you have some small flickering signs of hope. Leading up to the Paris climate change event, people around the world have been called to just take actions themselves, stand up, be counted. November the 27th, I think in Australia there are going to be small groups of people gathered everywhere. Are you of the opinion that groups like churches and other NGOs, community bodies, should get out there, stand up and begin the process of walking, just walking, to actually begin take some small step?
I think it's a powerful symbolism. However, I think that the long duration of these things means action now is unlikely to probably have any effect on the outcomes at Paris.
Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, surely.
That's a wonderful thing to do it, but I think that we need to be not just given to embracing the warmth of the symbolism, but really engaging with the depth of the issues and the long time run we need to really address these things. And so, questions about our energy policy, how we set up in this country policies that can, certainly there's some good things happening. Remote towns are being supplied with solar power. These are very positive things, but I think that it's important we do that. It's important we have the symbolism, but important we look deeper than that for the things that will really carry us through to significant policy.
Robert Manne.
March. I hope there's huge marches all over Australia, and I hope there are huge marches across the world, because it's a political question in the end, and only massive political, non-violent, massive political action, including what will be called civil disobedience, non-violent civil disobedience, I'm all in favour of, and massive marches, which are not civil disobedience, are democratic manifestations, I think will change the political atmosphere. And a man, Malcolm Turnbull, who's shown on the Republic that he's willing to give away something he once apparently cared about, should not be allowed to give away something he also apparently cared about, which was to take action on climate change. And marches in Australia might make him change his mind and go back to what he once claimed to care about.
Thank you both. Philip Freier, Robert Manne, and you, of course.
Well, thank you all for your part in the conversation. You've already thanked our panel. There's clearly a lot more to say, a lot more to learn, a lot more to do. So the conversation continues. As I said at the beginning, this is the last of these conversations for this year, so if you're not already, please do join the email list to be informed about the plans for next year's conversations. And I will hand over to Archbishop Philip to draw our morning to a close. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, John, for your moderation of our discussion this morning, Robert, and thank you for everyone being here. Can I wish you, as we approach the end of the year and Christmas, some times of reflection, not just increased activity. If you are taking up Robert's invitation to march in the lead up to Paris, I hope you do that safely and with confidence, and I hope you really can engage in some of these issues, because I think it does need not just us as individuals, but in all the groups we have, to really have a voice that can come into the forming of policy in a society like ours, where our voice can be heard. So can I close with a prayer, offering all these things that we've spoken to God? Loving God, we thank you that we have a world which is one of beauty and wonder, wonderfully created, in which we are a part. Help us to understand our deep connectedness to all of the people and all created things. Help us to understand and value the earth, the gifts from which we draw our life, and can we be good stewards and sharers in these things, that we can pass them on to future generations in a way that they will value what they have. It'll be a place of giftedness and a place for flourishing. And so we know that there are many things which seem bigger than our imagination, but we pray that we would have wisdom amongst us to answer these questions in the way which will be sustainable and a blessing, especially to those who are the most poor and disadvantaged in our world. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you for your participation today.